Many years ago, a school used to stand in Charterhouse Square. Indeed, it used to stand above, if you believe the legends, a plague pit. And according to legend, the boys believed that you could actually hear the muffled cries of the living who had been thrown in among the dead in the plague pit. And indeed, if you further believe the story, pupils used to actually tease newcomers to the school by making them press their ear to the ground to see if they could actually hear those buried alive in the plague pit. These kind of stories constitute something called children's folklore, and it's a fascinating area of study in which we look at the folklore that's actually passed between children rather than from adults to children. So if you want to learn more about it, stick around because that's what we're going to be looking at in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you're doing well. As I record this, it's actually Friday the 13th, so happy Friday the 13th to me. Obviously, when you hear this, it'll be the 14th and therefore completely irrelevant. Anyway, we are continuing with the folklore of life stages as it is August, and we did pregnancy and childbirth last week, so we're going to move on to childhood. And obviously in terms of life stages, people might claim that they remember their birth, but it's kind of highly unlikely. So childhood is basically the first life stage that we actually remember. It's also a time when we learn to communicate, we gain our bearings, and we try out hundreds of interests to see which ones fit. But how does it relate to folklore? Well, this is where it ended up getting a little bit difficult, because when I was trying to decide what to include for this, it ended up being a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be. So was it going to focus on folklore about children and childhood? Was it going to be folk customs and practices carried out by children, or folklore associated with childhood? Well, a lot of the folklore about children basically ended up being practices to keep them safe from harm or to divert illness elsewhere. So it seemed more useful to turn instead to children's folklore itself. And here, adults are often missing from the equation other than to collect the lore, which kind of makes it a little bit more interesting in my humble opinion. Now, it may be useful at this point to note the somewhat slippery and expansive definition of the word folklore. Now, folklorethursday.com defines it as the traditions, beliefs, customs and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. Now, obviously, children's lore therefore becomes quite a fascinating example because it also passes across generations and children do actually constitute a community of their own. It's also an absolutely massive topic, massive. So I've tried to keep the focus on the British Isles since it's what I know and obviously can remember some of the children's lore from when I was younger. And if you are more interested in the US, then there is a book called Children's Folklore, a source book, and I'll put the link to that below, so you might want to have a look at that. And obviously, if you are looking at the British Isles, I will recommend another book when I get to it. But obviously, I have had to massively cherry pick what I include, but hopefully this episode will act as a springboard into your own research. Obviously, these episodes are quite short anyway, so I kind of hope that for all of them, that if something catches your eye or even catches your ear, then you can obviously pop over to the blog post that's linked below and take a look at the references and possibly follow them to see what rabbit hole you end up falling down. But we are basically going to have a look at what children's folklore is, and then I thought we would have a look at children's games, nursery rhymes and fortune-telling practices among children. So let's get cracking. So the term children's folklore refers to the folklore shared by children. So it's basically differentiated from folklore about or taught to them. Now, as Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Rowd point out, and I quote, "Echoes of adult traditions can be found in children's lore, but there is rarely any evidence that these date back more than 300 or 400 years at most," end quote. So there are some people who like to try and claim that practices are ancient, but it's highly unlikely that they are, mainly because of the fact that the nature of people has changed, let alone the era considered childhood. But it's still worth using as an umbrella term. It covers things like games, rhymes, jokes, taunts, nicknames and truce terms. And children's folklore appears to be most active between the ages of 6 and 12. And Sylvia Ann Grider actually suggests that the traditions largely end with the beginning of adolescence. I just want to quickly make a point there as well about this thing that people have about wanting to try and find ancient origins to everything. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to study something and it's only 200 years old because it's still 200 years old. That's still quite a long period of time. And even if something's only just sprung up in about the last 20 or 30 years, again, it's still worthy of study if enough people are devoting their time and attention to it, I would argue. But there we go. Now, children's folklore first started to be collected in the 1840s in England by J.O. Halliwell, and then in Scotland, Edward W.B. Nicholson collected Scottish children's lore in an 1897 book. And what he did was he collected essays written by children about their lore, used those as a basis for the book, and actually listed the authors of the ones he chose as the prize-winning ones as his co-authors, which is quite cool. And then Alice B. Gomm also collected traditional childhood games from England, Scotland and Ireland in the 1890s. That actually runs to 2 volumes. That's how many she managed to collect. And the first one, at least, I haven't looked to see if the second one's on there, but the first one is on archive.org. And then meanwhile, Iona and Peter Opie are perhaps the giants in the field. And they also turned directly to children in the 1950s as their primary respondents. And indeed, one of the best known books on the subject is their book, The Law and Language of School Children, which I do recommend, although do bear in mind that obviously this is from the 1950s, and obviously children have changed. A lot of the things that are in the book are about people like walking to school and having a rabbit run across their path, and I think that's probably a little bit less likely to happen in like the middle of biker. But there we go. So I just want to mention that, the fact that yes, it's a very interesting book and it's fascinating, but also I do feel like someone should probably do a new version as well. In the US, Dorothy Howard also collected children's rhymes directly from children, and she did that in the 1930s. Now, aside from the books in the 1890s in England, few scholars really troubled themselves with children's folklore because, as Grider points out, a common assumption is that if something is not serious, such as being related to food or work, then it must be trivial. And therefore, if it's trivial, it's not worthy of study. But given we all pass through childhood, and it's such a formative part of our lives, then clearly studying children's folklore should really carry more weight. And besides this, looking at children's folklore also allows folklorists to explore, and I quote, the shared experiences of the human condition, end quote. Now, one of the side points of children's lore, surprisingly, is actually urban legends, and I'd always associated the telling of these with sleepovers and older teens. And indeed, you do find in The Law and Language of School Children that the telling of ghost stories or otherwise hushed stories where the final line is then yelled to give like a fright to whoever's listening, they've been around for many, many years. But as I say, I was surprised to see urban legends in there. And when I looked at children's lore collected by the Dartmouth Folklore Archive in America, many of the legends were actually heard when respondents were in 8th grade or 13 years old. Now, famous examples of shared stories that they collected would be things like Bloody Mary, who we have done before, the iced bathtub organ removal, which is the legend of somebody meeting a person in a bar and then waking up in a bathtub full of ice and finding that one or several of their organs have been removed, and the man in the back seat, which is the other one. And these legends became a way to encounter threatening situations within a space of shared safety. And in many ways, as far as I can tell, they're sort of updates of the old legends about monsters like Jenny Greenteeth. And in legends like that, she or the Grindylow would drag children into the deepest parts of the rivers if they ventured into the shallows. And the stories essentially contain warnings about something dangerous that could happen in a specific situation. Adults then pass on these old legends to children to encourage safe actions. Yet because they're cautionary tales told by adults, there's an air of instruction about them. Meanwhile, many of the urban legends are passed between children, and yes, adults as well. But between children, they take on a slightly different air, because when adults tell urban legends, they're tied up in the idea of danger that could happen to them. Yet when children pass them on, it's more about dangers that lie ahead in adulthood, and these monsters feel far closer than Jenny Greenteeth. Now, of course, children do also pass on these silly legends as a means of teasing each other. So look at the legend of the Charterhouse plague pit that opened this episode. And essentially, what it was, there was a plague pit in the area of the Charterhouse school, and people claimed that the living had been tossed into the plague pit among the plague dead. And according to Ed Glinnett, the boys at the Charterhouse school had somewhat heard this legend that their schoolyard lay above this plague pit. And rumour has it that, and I quote, pupils used to tease newcomers by taking them into the square and pressing their ears to the ground to test whether they could hear the anguished cries of those Black Death victims who had been buried alive underneath, end quote. So here, the legend then provides an initiation test for the unwary. And they use the urban legend less to warn against danger, but to kind of flirt with danger, again in a safe space. So if that's urban legends, then what of nursery rhymes? Now that may seem like a really weird segue, but ultimately nursery rhymes are often some of the first stories, and I say that in inverted commas, that we learn, because they actually help children to acquire language, they help them to process it. Often they have a tune with them that makes them easy to learn, which also helps children with an ear for music. Yet despite the fact that we use them essentially as an educational aid, people still like to consider them to be works of political satire or have somehow encoded with hidden information. Are they? Really? Now, as Simpson and Roud note, and I quote, nursery rhymes have suffered the indignity of having more nonsense written about them than any other folklore genre, end quote. Now, I did find one website that claimed people use nursery rhymes for secret codes because of the fact that they were easy to remember and therefore pass on. The same person also claimed that people had to do so in such a covert way because direct descent was an act of treason. Yet the same website also goes on to say that the link between the rhymes and historical events has largely been forgotten. So it does seem a little bit unlikely that simply having a knowledge of history means that you can unravel the secret meaning of a children's rhyme. And I do also think there's something a little bit strange about that, because one of the nursery rhymes, Mary, Mary, Quite Contrary, is often believed to be about Mary the First and her somewhat punishing regime, shall we say. And I can't help thinking, in an era where there wasn't mass media, there wasn't mass publication, and there wasn't also mass travel, someone might make up a rhyme about it in one place. How would it then spread somewhere else? Unless somebody was basically travelling around the country teaching nursery rhymes. Like, it all just to me seems a little bit too convenient, but that's just me. And I have obviously talked before about the mistake of thinking Ring a Ring of Roses is about the plague. And if you want to know more about that one, then I have put a link to that below. Now, sometimes these covert meanings don't work when the rhymes appear in different languages, and it's also hard to find evidence of a lot of the nursery rhymes actually existing before the 18th century. Now, Simpson and Rowe do concede that it's possible that the rhymes do have earlier origins that we're aware, and that the 18th century is just when they're committed to print, but they do caution against seeking meaning where there is possibly none to be found. And Elizabeth Galway suggests that nursery rhymes were often intended to help children learn numbers and the alphabet. And she does note that a lot of the traditional rhymes were actually shared by adults and children, rather than being written specifically for children, but I do still think we should be somewhat wary about assuming they were actually vehicles for sedition. Now we're going to go from rhymes to games, because obviously there is a similarity there. It's all about an element of learning through play, and one of the longest running children's games would appear to be hide and seek. Now there are two different versions. In one, people seek out an object, sometimes called Hunt the Thimble, and then the other, seekers look for hidden people. And as Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Rowe point out, no one can definitively prove the game's age, because the only documentary evidence comes through references to phrases associated with the game, rather than talking about the game directly. So there's no way to know if these references are specifically about the game, although if they are, then one of the first references comes in Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, which would be quite cool. Now, according to Alice Gom, Scottish children called the game Ho Spy after the words called out by the boys once they'd hidden. And yes, only boys could play the game. So essentially, the seeker was called the spy, and they would choose a parley spot, or they would stand on this spot while everyone went off and hid. They then shouted Ho Spy to let him know that they'd hidden, and once everyone had shouted, he could then go looking for them. Once the spy found a boy, he then had to run to the parley, followed by the boy that he'd found. And if the boy he'd found managed to overtake him, then the spy had to carry him on his back to the parley, and then essentially go looking for the next one. And the game was over when the seeker had found all of the boys and put them all in this spot. And it sounds like a really simplistic game, but I suppose in a lot of ways it would certainly keep you out of mischief for a while. I even mentioned this to my mother last night while I was telling her what the episode was going to be about, and she recited a time when she'd been playing hide and seek with friends and then had to go in for a tea and forgot to tell everybody. So they like supreme hiding place, or what, just simply going home. And obviously the next day they were like, "Where were you? We couldn't find you." And she was like, "Oops, I forgot to say I'd gone home." And I just thought that was a marvellous way to win a game of hide and seek, just going home and forgetting to say. Anyway, aside from hide and seek, we also have marbles, and the first definite references to the game actually appear in 13th century Germany. And this is one of the cool things about physical games. There's a much longer, tangible trace of evidence, which is why it's brilliant when you look at board games being traced all the way back to ancient Egypt and their game of Senet. But as far as marbles have been concerned, items that could have been used to play marbles have also been found in Egyptian tombs. Obviously, we don't know if that's what they were actually used for, but it's interesting that they had them. And over the centuries, marbles have actually been made from clay, alabaster, marble itself, metal and glass. You won't be surprised to learn that not many people wanted to play marbles with someone who had metal ones, because they were essentially more like ball bearings and would obviously break anything that essentially wasn't made from marble or metal as well. So glass ones, you'd just lose them. And the cat's eye glass marble is perhaps a type of marble that most people will recognise, and that's the one with the coloured twist in the middle that obviously could then be made much more cheaply with advances in glass manufacture. Now, it is quite hard to find a definitive set of rules for marbles. I thought there was one, but apparently not. People used to play them in different ways from place to place, which again is one of the interesting things about studying children's law. The same game can then have different rules depending on where you are, and indeed when you are. Now, Alice Gomm's Compendium of Games from 1894 is a great source, and like I say, it is on archive, and you can find the link to that in my blog post. But I did think I would highlight a couple of the games that she mentioned just because they caught my eye. And one of them is called All in the Well and comes from Newcastle. And in this one, the children would make a circle on the ground, which is around 8 inches wide, which became the well. And then they would stand a 4-inch wooden peg in the middle with a button on top. The object of the exercise was to throw a stick at the peg to knock the button off. If you got the button out of the well, then you basically won. But you couldn't just simply rock up and play it, you had to actually buy a throw. So children would then buy their throw with marbles or buttons. And then that way, if they did actually manage to knock the button out of the well, then they would win double what they'd paid for the throw. So they would essentially just get like more marbles or whatever currency they had chosen to use back. I also want to mention finally that the game Noughts and Crosses was also known as Kit Kat Canio, and Gomm suggests that whoever starts has an advantage because they can put their X or O in the middle. Now I wanted to close out with fortune telling because it's the closest to the kind of topics that I normally cover here on Fabulous Folklore, so it kind of links in quite nicely with everything else. And fortune telling games are actually really quite popular with children, and Iona and Peter Opie actually report a game called Spooks, which was described by a 14-year-old girl. And listed by the Opies as spirit spelling, it's basically a very similar practice to a Ouija board, except instead of having the actual board and a planchette, they would use slips of paper with letters on and then a glass tumbler, and the children would put their fingers on the tumbler, and then they would ask a question about the future, and then it would spell out their answer. So they were trying to find out about the future rather than trying to open an active dialogue with the dead. Naturally, a game such as this would be open to mischief, with children pushing the tumbler where necessary. The Opies also describe an 11-year-old girl who used playing cards as a fortune-telling device. Now, there are people who do legitimately use playing cards as a divinatory device, so you don't have to use oracle cards or tarot cards. But for this particular little girl, rather than reading each individual card, she read by suit. So it didn't really matter what number it was just if you got a spade, it meant hard work was on the way. Diamonds meant money was coming. Clubs meant forthcoming illness, and hearts represented good luck. So here, the child actually entered into a divinatory practice that did stretch back several centuries, although it's quite unlikely that she knew the history of her chosen tool. And finally, they also included a film star oracle, and by the 1990s, we knew them as just as fortune tellers, and these paper oracles were all the rage at my school, and they were essentially like the low-tech version of a magic 8-ball. Now, the Opies don't date how old they are, but obviously for their book to have come out in the 50s, we know that these fortune tellers at least date to the 50s in England. And obviously, again, little did we know as 12-year-olds that we were engaging in a long history of fortune telling. And ultimately, we used to use them to ask sort of yes and no questions, but some people used to actually write proper fortunes in them as well. So they were quite flexible in how you actually wanted to do them. And I prefer the yes or no answer ones because I sort of think that trying to write a full list of things on the inside can be a little bit difficult depending on the size of your handwriting. What I have done is I am actually going to include a video on how to make one in case you want to have a go, because I don't know, you might want to keep your kids entertained because the folding instructions on paper can be a bit confusing. So I've got a video on how to make them on my blog. If you're watching this on YouTube, then it's going to literally start like now. So you do need a square piece of paper to make one of these fortune tellers, but I'm going to show you how to make it out of a rectangular one. I'm using A4 because I'm in the UK, but this will also work if you've got American sizes. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to fold one corner over to make sort of a diagonal across the paper, like so. So I end up with that kind of shape. And then that means I now know where the square of the paper is. So I'm just going to... And then all I need to do is fold that piece over like that. And then I'm just going to tear that piece off. Obviously, feel free to use scissors if you'd like a neater finish, but I feel like I'm doing the rough and ready DIY version here. So there we go. we've now got sort of a square. And then all I'm going to do is I'm then going to fold that over that way, because I need to find the centre of the paper now for the next set of folds, like that. So you should end up with a piece of paper like that. And then what I'm going to do from here is I'm then just going to fold the corners into the middle, which is obviously makes it a lot easier now that I know where the middle is. I'm going to fold that over. Obviously use the thinnest paper you can for these, because it starts to get quite difficult to do folds and to manipulate the paper once the paper gets too thick. That will become apparent in a minute. And then I'm just going to lift those out of the way so I can actually see the middle. There. Like that. So you end up with the first series of folds like that. Then take your square, turn it over, and then obviously you can see how it's now divided into 4 on the other side as well. So you then just need to fold each of these into the middle again, and these are essentially going to give you the flaps where you can then write your fortune, whether you want to do that as yes and no answers, or if you want to write out something a little bit more cryptic. That's entirely up to you. I'll leave that to your discretion. But that basically gives you, oops, just folded that over the wrong way. That then gives you another series of folds on this side. And then what you need to do, just while I get myself comfortable, is you then need to essentially fold it over like so, and then this gives you your flaps. That sounds so wrong, you'll have to forgive me for that. Then if you can push them like that, so they stand up like that, and then fit your finger and thumb, that side's a bit more tricky, like that. And that gives you your fortune teller. I am of course going to do one of those here's one I made earlier moments, which I've always wanted to do, and I've put colours on these outer folds because then that gives you something to actually know which one you're choosing. So if I fold that in half as I did with the other one, and then pop finger and thumb into all of these the correct way around. This is really difficult to film, by the way. So sorry that it's not exactly like Ridley Scott. Yeah, so I would then pick, for example, red. So I would go R, E, D. And then I would have a look at the numbers on the inside, and then I would pick 3 because I'm lazy. And then I would go 1, 2, 3, and then I might go 7. So say I asked the question, will you watch this video all the way through? And then I would open it up, lift the flap, maybe. So we will see if I was right. But that is basically how to make one of these. Obviously I've just numbered each of the inner flaps, written a load of things on. So I've written like maybe, don't count on it, yes, no, things like that. And then colour the outside. You can write whatever you want on these, really, it's entirely up to you. But if you do make one, please do let me know how it goes and whether you enjoyed it, and let me know how your fortune teller went. Right, okay. Obviously at that now you'll have to imagine on YouTube it just cut to a video and it was all really slick. But anyway, you're listening to the audio version, so there we go. At our school, what we did was we would put colours on the outer flaps, and essentially if someone then chose blue, you would then count out 4 times for each of the letters in the word blue, opening and closing the fortune teller for each letter. In the Opie's version, they had the names of film stars on the outside, so you would then count out for each letter in their name. And then the inner flaps bore numbers to dictate again the number of times that you would again open and close the fortune teller. And then the querent would choose a number and you would lift that flap to reveal their fortune. As I say, we used a lot of yes, no, not likely, think again on the inside. I'm sure other people, as I say, did write longer fortunes, but again, it's quite a lot to fit in a small space. And I don't really think that we actually thought we were predicting the future, but when you're 11, any semblance of control over uncertainty can seem welcome. And indeed, I think this is part of the value of children's folklore as a whole, because being a child is both extremely simple and complex at the same time. Our needs are hopefully met by those around us, leaving us hopefully free from the cares of adulthood. But I do appreciate that this is not the case for all children, which is deeply, deeply sad. But on the whole, we don't need to calculate taxes, drive to work, or balance a network of friendships, relationships, work colleagueships, and all that kind of stuff. It's essentially a time where we can explore the limits of our world, make friends, and engage in play. But the world can then seem like it's changing as we explore it. So shared traditions, practices, and rituals are then codified as games, sayings, and stories. And these traditions and practices become a way to navigate the world. We pass these among one another in a language that's largely overlooked or dismissed by adults in order to feel safe and in some kind of control. And look at how many films show youngsters gathering to defeat the forces of darkness that adults cannot or will not see. Both Monster House and The Hole are both excellent examples. So this children's law essentially becomes a way to protect the shared childhood community even when it seems that adults won't. So yes, some of it can seem a little silly, like telling the future with a homemade Ouija board, but that doesn't make it any the less worthy of study. So what I'd like to know is, do you recognise any of these practices from your own childhood? What traditions did you and your peers follow? As always, you can get in touch with me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can email me if you want. Any way that's easy for you. Obviously, you can leave a comment on YouTube as well. As always, the links are in the blog post, which is linked from this podcast episode. So I hope that you find that helpful as well. And if you do have any things that you remember, it would be just awesome to hear what people got up to, really. And also if anybody else made paper fortune tellers and how yours might have varied. If you do have a go at making any of the paper fortune tellers, do let me know how it goes. But anyway, that is the end of this week's episode. Next week, we're going to move on to weddings, because obviously they're a life stage that not everybody passes through, but most people will still know someone who's had a wedding at some point, and they'll know quite what a massive faff they seem to be. So yeah, I thought I'd do folklore of weddings and whatnot, and then we're going to do the folklore of moving house and sort of readying your new house and even finding a house and so on, things like that. So we'll do that at the end of August. If you are a Patreon supporter at the $3.50 a month or more tiers, then this month's exclusive episode will be about land spirits, because we did house spirits last month because it just ended up being far too big to do them both in the same episode. So look forward to that towards the end of the month. So that is it from me for now. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.